They are the foot soldiers of evil, humanoids with greenish skin, other times grayish, brown, white, black, and even red. Their stench, twisted teeth, and evil eyes always foretell their allegiance to their dark master. Hello, and welcome back to another video from Secrets of the Rings. Today we trace back in time the origins of one of the most popular and sometimes enigmatic evil creatures in Middle-earth's history, Orcs, in all their variety, cultures, and characteristics. The origin of Orcs is usually contested, even by the wise scholars of men and elves. The debate usually pinpoints their beginnings around the year of the trees 1330, as this was their first documented encounter, when Orcs were seen roaming Beleriand alongside other evil creatures such as wolves and other fell beings of shadow. There is a consensus that points to the fact that without the first Dark Lord Morgoth and his corruption, Orcs would not have come into being. Under their various migrations and pillaging, they were oftentimes seen leaving Angband towards the east side of the Blue Mountain Passages, which were a direct route to the Sindar elves who dwelt in the region. As creatures of darkness, they were often seen as cruel, pitiless, and doing all sorts of wicked acts against elves, men, dwarves, and even animals who crossed their path, all purely for sport and amusement. Although relentless servants, commonly used as slaves or the foot soldiers of the armies of Morgoth, Sauron, and even Saruman, the Orcs are often observed as having a contentious side, especially when stationed far away from the reach of their more powerful masters. In terms of disobedience and leadership, Orcs can more easily disobey rules or direct commands, and they will even fight amongst themselves. Their hierarchy is usually understood as the one with more power will lead, which also means the crueler, the more cunning, or a combination of these traits, usually selected by their master or after fighting amongst themselves to decide. When one Orc can instill more fear upon the rest of the group by his deeds, that Orc will likely rise in the ranks amongst his peers. Merciless, Orcs come from a culture of daily hardship and tribal rituals. During battles, they can be quite ferocious, even attacking nearby allies occasionally in their fray. Although somewhat simple in mindset and known for their vicious nature, Orcs are quite adept to taming wild creatures such as wolves and wargs, along with other beasts who are deemed useful to serve the Dark Lord's plans. Their simple mindset also demonstrates their true nature of being powerless to resist domination from a stronger will. A will initially from Morgoth himself, and later on from Sauron, and eventually even Saruman with his Uruk-hai and other intermediary breeds. When dominated, the Orcs are prone to be more regulated, living consistently more like slaves and soldiers in the machinery of war of their masters. Without leadership and a clear dominion over their will, Orcs can become increasingly reactive, consumed by hatred and petty rivalries that cause tribes to slay each other for the sake of supplies, gold, territory, or even a simple disrespect during their dealings. On the other hand, when isolated, the Orcs tend to become more scattered, more disunited, and without a clear purpose, opting to simply cause mayhem with their raids on rural settlements of men, while also skirmishing amongst themselves as they live out their tribal life. This particular scenario was observed after the War of Wrath, where after the fall of Morgoth, the Orcs became confused, disunified without their master's commands, and therefore scattered by their enemies during the following millennia. The Orcs hid themselves within small tribes around the region of the Misty Mountains and the Angmar mountain range. If put together, these tribes could pose a serious regional threat, but isolated as they were, only travelers using such passages and small settlements around the outskirts of their domains initially suffered from their raids. In terms of characteristics and behaviors, the species comes in a variety of conditions, depending on their region and overall habits. Orcs from the mountains were similar to dwarves in the sense that they would often not venture very far from their homes, unless necessary, such as in wars, raids to get supplies and slaves, or lastly if their home was considered lost, making them leave in turn to search for a new one. An example of these types of Orcs are the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, who played an important part in the events of the Second and Third Age of Middle-earth, from waging wars with the dwarves and retaking the old fortress of Gundabad, and later on Moria, to even killing Isildur, the first ring-bearer after Sauron, and causing the One Ring to remain lost for centuries to come. Next on our list is the Eastern Orcs faction, who disbanded from Morgoth's forces after the Battle of Powers. These are one of the fiercest and oldest factions of Orcs, while also remaining one of the hardest to command, due to their particularly long time spent initially distant from the unifying domain of Sauron, or another being with stronger will commanding them. Eventually they were conquered by Sauron and unified under his banner, later in the Third Age. Snagga is a black speech term for slave, and were meek orcs commonly seen amongst stronger forces, being the ones to craft them their armor and weapons, supply them with food, and operate the daily routines of the strongholds, both at Mordor with Sauron and at Isengard with Saruman. Snufflers were a sort of hunter, specialized in archery and tracking. They were smaller in stature and lighter on their feet, rendering themselves especially useful in tracking targets and preparing ambushes, as they could draw less attention than their bigger counterparts, while also attacking from a distance with their bows and arrows. On the other hand, the Orcs of Mordor are a series of orc tribes which inhabited the land of Mordor around the plains of Gorgoroth, Cirith Ungol, and even Minas Morgul. They were amongst the cruelest and fiercest orcs bred by Sauron, and made up the backbone of his legions. They were overall bigger, sometimes large and bulky, and other times sleek and tall. The Uruks, a distinct race of orcs, were seen late in the Third Age. They were initially seen in Mordor, though sometimes confused with their Isengard counterpart due to Saruman's own work in breeding a new race. Sauron bred these first orcs around the year 2475 of the Third Age, when they were first seen during the last years of stewardship of Denethor I from Gondor. They conquered Ithilien until it became deserted by the year 2901. In general terms, both Mordor and Isengard Uruks shared similar traits, such as being faster than normal orcs, being able to travel during daylight without being weakened while also being stronger, smarter, and larger than their other counterparts. Because of this, their equipment was different, such as their armor that was made stronger, bulkier, as they could withstand heavier weights during their march towards battle. Their swords were no longer curved scimitars, but long and broad swords now, for greater reach and havoc when attacking. Their bows were also unique, as they were made of yew trees, making them sturdier than the average bow. The bowstring was also harder to pull when aiming, as it required extra strength to hold, but that granted a longer range for the Uruk-hai to hit its target, while also giving him a more powerful piercing shot. The Uruk-hai were also embroiled in tails and are difficult to pinpoint in origin. It is said that they were made with a cross of races between orcs and men, many Dunlendings in the case of Isengard Uruks, while others claim they were partly elves, imprisoned and tortured for long periods, cursed with black magic, and eventually corrupted and crossed between breeds, until becoming what they eventually were known for. Nonetheless, their gruesome nature is fed by reports of cannibalism amongst themselves, and considering man-flesh a special treat. During Saruman's ventures at Isengard, before reaching the culmination of his work that resulted in the Uruk-hai, it is said that Saruman experimented breeding along the way half-orcs and goblin men, although the distinction between the two is hard to distinguish. Half-orcs were known to be a mix between Dunlendings and orcs, which resulted in a sickly yellow skin. Large men, with a lynx-eyed, evil figure. They were more cunning and vile in general than the common orc. According to Professor Tolkien in his late life, in the Morgoth's Ring, edited by his son Christopher, he points out that it became clear in time that undoubted men could, under the domination of Morgoth or his agents, in a few generations be reduced almost to the orc level of mind and habits, and then they would or could be made to mate with orcs, producing new breeds, often larger and more cunning. There is no doubt that long afterwards in the Third Age, Saruman rediscovered this, or learned of it in lore, and in his lust for mastery committed this, his wickedest deed, the interbreeding of orcs and men, producing men-orcs, large and cunning, and orc men, treacherous and vile. Lastly, we have the hobgoblin kind, as described by Gandalf when warning Bilbo Baggins that the Grey Mountains were simply stiff with goblins, hobgoblins, and orcs of the worst description. It is a disputed fact, though, as it could also mean the opposite, especially when considering the fact that the orcs that inhabited the mountains were usually of smaller stature, more prone to climbing, entering crevices and inhabiting smaller spaces. The lifespan of orcs remains a mystery, with some arguing them to live as much as some Númenóreans, or even the long-lived dwarves, while others claiming orcs to be immortals, just as elves. Drawing focus to one of the main theories that describes orcs' origins being as corrupted elves, and elves are immortal, the orcs would likely continue to be, or at the very least, have incredibly long-lived lives. One clear measurement for their lifespan can be observed by studying the case of the orc chieftains Azog and Bolg. Bolg was the son of Azog, who was killed during the Battle of Azanulbizar in the year 2799 of the Third Age, while Bolg was present leading the orc legions during the Battle of the Five Armies during the year 2941 of the Third Age. Therefore, Bolg was at least 142 years old during the Battle of Five Armies, and was considered at the peak of his skills at the time to be able to lead the dark forces on the occasion. And this concludes today's quest of unraveling some of the mysteries behind the lore of the orc, a species that infested Middle-earth for over a millennia, being present and causing incredible turmoil during most of the main events of Arda's history.